Hello everyone, and welcome to CIRA's online learning. Understand your obligations under the AODA, and we will direct you to where you can learn more. In addition to these webinars, there is a comprehensive guide available on our website in two places, under the Information for Landlords tab and under the Resources tab. Today, an estimated 1 in 5 Canadians report having a disability, and the number of Ontarians living with disabilities is expected to rise in years to come. As Ontario's population ages, accessibility will become more important. My name is Alyssa Brierly. I'm the Executive Director and General Counsel at the Centre for Equality Rights in Accommodation, also known as CIRA. And I'm here with Carly Bowie, Project Coordinator. For those who are not familiar with CIRA, we are a charitable organization that works to advance housing rights in Ontario. We do this by providing direct service to renters in Ontario facing eviction or human rights barriers in their housing, by doing litigation, and by providing public education sessions like this one. We know that housing providers are faced with a complex challenge of adhering to municipal and provincial laws and responding to the diverse needs of their renters. The purpose of this webinar series is to help clarify your requirements under the AODA. It also covers how the AODA works with other legislation and offers useful tips on how to ensure that your business practices promote accessibility. The first 3 modules in this webinar series cover obligations under the AODA and how the AODA works with other legislation. Our 4th module will review frequently asked questions about the AODA. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that these webinars were made possible by the funding received through an Enabling Change partnership project with the Government of Ontario, and we are grateful for their support. And before we start, a quick disclaimer. This webinar and the accompanying guide are intended to provide general information about your accessibility obligations. It is not legal advice, nor is it intended to substitute for legal advice. For information or questions about your specific situation, please consult a lawyer.
In this module, we are going to cover the Information and Communication Standard. It is particularly relevant to housing providers as it helps to build strong relationships with their renters. This standard will help make their information and communications accessible for people with disabilities. It is important for housing providers to understand what barriers can exist so they can work to remove them. We will review a number of examples with you. The Design of Public Spaces Standard requires housing providers to make public spaces accessible to people with disabilities. This applies when building new public spaces or making significant alterations to existing ones. While housing providers are not obligated to retrofit existing public areas, CIRA strongly encourages them to meet these requirements if they have the capacity to do so. There are 5 subsections of the Design of Public Spaces Standard that apply to housing providers. They pertain to outdoor public eating areas, exterior paths of travel, accessible parking, obtaining service, and maintenance planning. Please note that there are 2 other subsections, beach and trail access and outdoor play areas, which may apply to some housing providers, but are not included in this webinar. There are 4 requirements under the Information and Communication Standard that apply to housing providers. The first is accessible formats and communication supports. The second is feedback processes for employees and the public. The third is emergency and public safety information. And the fourth is accessible websites and web content.
If asked by a renter with a disability, all private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers must provide information in accessible formats or with communication supports. Examples include plain language, sign language interpreters, reading information out loud, or providing written notes. The accessible formats and communication supports must be provided as soon as possible and at no additional cost. Housing providers must consult with the renter who is requesting an accessible format or communication support to determine their accessibility needs. Both parties should work together to determine the most suitable format or communication support. For example, if a renter with vision loss requests that written correspondence from the housing provider be presented in an accessible format, they could decide together that the information will best be provided in an electronic file that is compatible with the renter's text-to-speech computer program. Visit the Accessible Digital Office Document Project website for more information on this.
All private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with 1 or more employees must be prepared to receive feedback from renters in different ways. This can include in person, by telephone, by email, or through questionnaires or comment cards. Whichever feedback process you have established for the customer service standard can be used for this as well. Emergency and public safety information from all private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with 1 or more employees must be provided in an accessible format or with communication supports if requested by a person with a disability. Examples of information include emergency plans and procedures, floor plans, especially evacuation routes, and information about alarms or other emergency alerts.
All private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with 50 or more employees must make all new and significantly refreshed websites and web content posted after January 1st, 2012, accessible in accordance with international guidelines for website accessibility. These guidelines are called Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. Housing providers need to be familiar with 2 levels of success criteria for website accessibility, Level A and Level AA. Level A is the most basic level of accessibility for websites and web content. Achieving this level of accessibility includes, for example, providing pre-recorded captions for all pre-recorded audio content for synchronized media, including video and audio, and presenting the information on a different format or with time-based interactive components. Alternatively, text images that explain content and describe images to viewers can be used. All large organizations must currently meet Level A success criteria. Level AA is a more extensive level of accessibility for websites and web content. Requirements include resizing, allowing size to be increased up to 200% without losing content or function, and properly named headings and labels, which allows screen reader technology to easily scan and find appropriate sections of text. All large organizations, those are organizations with 50 or more employees, must meet level AA success criteria by January 1st, 2021. Please note there are 2 exemptions from the level AA compliance deadline: live captions and pre-recorded audio descriptions.
Accessibility barriers are obstacles that make it difficult for people with disabilities to do the things that most of us take for granted, like grocery shop, work, or take public transit. The AODA standards work to help housing providers identify, remove, and prevent barriers for renters with disabilities. Often, barriers are thought of as only physical obstacles, but barriers can be both seen and unseen. A barrier is anything that prevents a person with a disability from fully participating in society because of their disability. It doesn't matter if the barrier was created intentionally or by mistake. If something is an obstacle to someone on account of a disability, it will be considered a barrier and must be addressed. There are 4 types of barriers that are identified in CIRA's AODA Guide for Housing Providers. They are physical barriers, information and communication barriers, attitudinal barriers, and systemic barriers.
Physical barriers are any physical features of a building or space that may prevent people from disabilities from fully using and enjoying the space. These are often the most obvious kinds of barriers. Some common physical barriers that may arise in a residential complex are a curb outside of a building, which may prevent renters who use scooters or wheelchairs from entering the building safely, or heavy doors to enter and exit the building, which cause barriers for renters who use mobility devices or have disabilities affecting their muscle strength and who may require an automatic door opener to safely enter and exit the building. Stairs in the residential complex or in the rental unit may be a barrier to renters who have disabilities that prevent them from using stairs and would be unable to access the upper floors of the building or rental unit. Common spaces that have a large amount of furniture and other items may be a barrier, as cluttered spaces may create barriers for vision impaired renters and make moving through the space difficult. And finally, unreliable elevators, or elevators that are often out of service, create significant barriers for renters with disabilities. For example, taking an elevator out of service may create challenges for renters who have breathing difficulties, who may not be able to use the stairs easily.
Information and communication barriers prevent people from being understood and from being able to understand information or communicate with others. The accessibility standards specifically require housing providers to develop policies that address these possible barriers. Information must be made available in accessible formats when requested. Accessible, easy-to-use feedback systems must also be developed. Some examples of information and communication barriers that may arise between a housing provider and a renter are providing written notice to a renter with vision loss may be a barrier. The renter may not be able to read the written notice and know its contents. Notices notices should be made available in large print and be made available for renters with vision loss in accessible formats, for example, in an accessible Microsoft Word or PDF document. Speaking at a pace that does not allow a renter with hearing loss to follow may be a barrier. The renter may need to communicate with the housing provider by reading lips or writing notes. Posting notices for all renters in a common area of the building may be a barrier. A renter with a mental health disability that prevents them from often leaving their rental unit may not see the notice. A housing provider could send all the notices out by email as well as posting them in the common areas. Communicating in person with renters about routine matters may be a barrier. A renter with social anxiety may need to communicate with the housing provider through writing or on the telephone. In addition, prospective renters should be considered as well. For example, a person who is looking to rent that uses screen reader technology. May not be able to navigate your website. Because it does not meet accessibility standards.
Attitudinal barriers are created when people make assumptions or there are misunderstandings about the needs or abilities of people with disabilities. Housing providers should always ask what a all private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with 50 or more employees must adhere to accessibility requirements for outdoor play spaces. Outdoor play spaces are areas that encourage creative, challenging experiences for children of all ages and abilities. Caregivers for persons with disabilities must also have the same access to these spaces. Outdoor play areas may have swings or features such as logs, rocks, sandboxes, or water play. Housing providers must get input from the public and persons with disabilities about the outdoor play spaces and incorporate features that allow children and their caregivers of different abilities to access them. These areas must incorporate accessibility features such as sensory and active play components and must ensure that the outdoor ground surface is firm, stable, and prevents injuries. There must also be sufficient clearance for people using mobility devices to access the various features and move around them safely. Ground surface and equipment accessibility requirements that apply to outdoor public eating areas also apply in the case of outdoor play spaces.
All private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with one or more employees must meet requirements for new off-street accessible parking. Off-street parking refers to lots used for short-term public use, such as visitors parking. If a housing provider is building new parking spaces and plans to maintain them, or is redeveloping parking spaces, which it will maintain, they must provide two types of accessible off-street parking. Standard spaces for people who use mobility and assistive devices, including canes and walkers, and wider spaces for people who use mobility aids, such as wheelchairs. All accessible spaces must have extra spaces called access aisles, which allow enough room for people with disabilities and mobility devices such as wheelchairs to safely get in and out of their vehicles. The IASR requires a minimum number of accessible parking spaces depending on the total number of spaces available. Please see sections 80.32 to 80.39. Please note that the IASR does not include requirements for private parking for tenants, but housing providers who do not provide accessible private parking may have obligations under the Ontario Human Rights Code to provide accommodations for renters with disabilities.
All private sector, nonprofit, and public housing providers with one or more employees are required to make new service counters, fixed queuing guides, and waiting areas accessible to people with disabilities. Service counters include when building new service counters or replacing existing ones, for example, the property management office or leasing office where rent is paid, housing providers are required to provide at least one counter that accommodates a mobility aid, such as a wheelchair or motorized scooter. Accessible counters must be clearly identified with signage in large print, pictographs, and braille. When multiple counters are available, a best practice would ensure that the accessible one must always be the first one opened and the last one closed to ensure accessibility for all customers. Fixed queuing guides are features that allow people to line up before approaching a service counter. A fixed queuing guide is fixed to the floor and is not movable. All fixed queuing guides must be detectable by a person with a vision impairment who uses a cane. This will also ensure that these fixed guides will not permit anyone who is an adult of a short stature, a person using a wheelchair, or a child to hit the guide ropes with their head or neck. When installing new fixed guides, housing providers must make sure there is enough width and turning space for people with mobility aids. Finally, when building a new waiting area or renovating an existing one, housing providers are required to make at least 3% of seating spaces accessible by ensuring that there is dedicated space in the seating area where someone using a mobility aid can wait. Ontario's Human Rights Code protects individuals and groups from discrimination and harassment on the basis of 16 prohibited grounds, including disabilities. The Code is one of the most important pieces of legislation in Ontario. Human rights law has primacy in Ontario, which means that it takes precedence over most other laws in the province. In other words, if there is a conflict between another law and the Code will most often prevail. Discrimination occurs when a person is treated unfairly or denied a benefit based on a characteristic or perceived characteristic under the Code, such as disability. Discrimination does not have to be intentional and can occur when someone is acting in good faith. The duty to accommodate is when a renter requests an accommodation for a disability and the housing provider has a legal duty to accommodate them. This means that the housing provider is legally obliged to respond to this request in good faith and to work with the renter to achieve a satisfactory level of accommodation. An example of a request to accommodate would be a renter in a wheelchair who requests that a ramp and an automatic door opener be installed outside the main entrance of a residential complex. The housing provider has an obligation to accommodate the renter up to the point of undue hardship. This may require additional accommodation measures that go beyond or are different from the standards established by the regulations of the AODA. The duty to accommodate is guided by three main principles: respect for dignity, individualization, and integration and full participation. These principles underwrite the Code's guiding philosophy that all Ontarians should benefit from equal access to opportunities and services.
Accommodation is a shared responsibility. Housing providers and renters need to work together to determine and implement appropriate accommodations. Housing providers should talk to renters about their specific needs and work towards creative solutions. Once a renter has made a request for accommodation to the housing provider, both parties must work together to find solutions. Responsibility of the housing providers include: accept the renter's request for accommodation, maintain confidentiality, grant accommodation requests in a timely manner, bear the cost of any required medical documentation or information, and bear the cost of accommodation up to the point of undue hardship.
Some housing providers think that the AODA requires them to make their buildings wheelchair accessible. This is not the case. The Design of Public Spaces standard may apply to some housing providers, for example, those who provide off-street parking. However, the AODA does not require buildings to be retrofitted to be wheelchair accessible. However, if a renter makes a specific accommodation request under Ontario's Human Rights Code that requires physical alterations to the building, a housing provider is required to accommodate the renter up to the point of undue hardship. Accessibility requirements for buildings, including residential complexes, are found in Ontario's Building Code. Accessibility requirements in the Building Code cover a range of areas, including updated requirements for barrier-free washrooms, power door operators, elevators, visual fire alarms, and accessible or adaptable seating in public assembly buildings, such as theaters, lecture halls, and places of worship. However, these requirements apply to most new construction and extensive renovations only. These amendments do not apply to existing residential housing, with the exception of smoke alarm requirements, where no renovation work is planned. However, it is important to remember that what is good for accessibility can be good for everyone. Ramps help people pushing strollers and delivering packages into your building too. So that is the end of our webinar, our second webinar on accessibility requirements for housing providers. Are there any questions at this time? Okay, well, we hope that you will join us again, same time, same place next week. And we will leave you again with a couple of slides of resources that can help you get some additional information about the AODA and your requirements.